Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kevin Hancock, and I'm Director of Sales Engineering here at Exostar. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar titled Cybersecurity Policy Management and Maintenance for Small and Medium-Sized Businesses. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. So today's webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour, including a short session at the end for questions and answers. Those questions were provided from the participants as part of their sign-up. If we don't get to all the questions, we will be following up with you with answers to those. All participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruption. So, as I mentioned, a large portion of today's event is dedicated to answering those pressing questions from the audience. We'll answer those questions at the end of today's event. If we do have an outage, and we haven't had one yet, please wait for a minute and just refresh your page, and everything should just be fine. For your convenience, there is a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms, acronyms, and initializations that will be referenced during today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on demand via the Exostar resource library. That's found on our website, www.exostar.com/resources. That'll be post-event, as well as this link. This same YouTube link will be accessible anytime. If you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts or request a copy of the slide deck we're using, please reach out to us at CMMC-team@exostar.com or use a live chat feature, again, from our website at www.exostar.com. Just a reminder, Exostar does have a free trial of our Policy Pro software. You can get a trial account for that at any time. There's a link to it in the YouTube description. It takes about 2 minutes to sign up. So if you'd like to work along with Sean, one of our speakers today, as he goes through his demonstration, feel free to go to sign up for that free trial now. So the agenda for today's webinar is as you see here. I'll introduce the speakers. We'll cover a section on cybersecurity policy management and maintenance for small and medium-sized businesses, including some case studies for both a small manufacturer and versus what typically a large DoD contractor has to go through. We'll provide a brief Policy Pro demo. Then we'll go over our questions and answers. And there will be an exit poll at the end, which we'd really appreciate it if you stayed and participated in that as well. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce the speakers today. I've already introduced myself. Again, I'm Kevin Hancock, Director of Sales Engineering here at Exostar. I'm joined today first by Tim Brennan. He's the CEO of SysArc, an IT managed services provider he founded in 2004. SysArc focuses on helping government contractors stand up effective cybersecurity programs for their internal systems to reduce risk, maintain business continuity, and comply with industry regulations and best practices. Tim has more than 20 years of experience in the IT industry, working in the government contracting and commercial industries in both technical and non-technical roles. The second portion of our webinar will have Sean Fornwalt. Sean serves as the Director of Client Technical Support Departments at ISMS Solutions and ISMS Applications. He's a member of the Policy Pro Development and Quality Assurance team. Prior to joining ISMS, interestingly enough, Sean worked for Harley-Davidson out in Santa Cruz, California, one of my favorite parts of the world. So as we get started here, Tim's going to take us through first. So Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great, Kevin. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. And thank you for your time today. As Kevin mentioned, I'm the CEO of SysArc. We've been an MSP working with government contractors for 15 years, managing their network infrastructure on an outsourced basis. And about 5 years ago, we started helping some of our customers with DFAR 7012. And in that time, we've consulted with well over 500 government contractors. We've done assessments or readiness assessments for both DFARs and CMMC for around 150 customers. And then out of those, I think we've done policies for 40 or 50 of those customers. And that number is a lot smaller than the number that we've assessed. And a lot of the times it's, for some reasons, documentation is usually the last thing people want to do. It's tedious, it's time consuming. And so it's difficult at times. So, but the DoD is very into documenting everything. And that's going to be a big part of their audit process, is looking and reviewing your policies and all the other documentation. So that's why we're here today. That's why we're talking about Policy Pro as a great tool to help you do that. So I can try to walk you through what our process typically is when we're helping a customer go through the DFARS or CMMC journey. It usually starts with step one as a readiness assessment. And now out of that, you have to have an SPRS score, system security plan, and a POAM. So we typically use Certification Assistant, which is another Exostar solution that we use quite a bit. And once you have that, you will figure out what items you need to remediate. Invariably, you have to get started with policies, because not many people have all the policies. Most people have no policies, and some people have, a few. So using a tool like Policy Pro, was great. I used to just use templates in a Word document. We used to do the assessments with spreadsheets, right? And that was 5 years ago when this sort of all started for us. But now we've been able to really reduce the time frame and complexity by using tools. So step two for us is building out the policies for each control family that are called out for in the NIST 1871. And so within Policy Pro, the first thing you do is build out your draft policies, either from scratch using Policy Pro templates, or modifying existing policies that you may already have and you put them into Policy Pro. And then there's the second step within the Policy Pro that we find extremely helpful, which is the assessment of the policies that you either have currently or that you create from scratch using the templates. And there's a scoring mechanism to let you know where you are, falling down, potentially where you need to improve your policies, what policies you need to add, et cetera, et cetera. And Sean will give you a demo of all that, but that's a really key feature for us when we have, a group or a customer that has a group of policies that they've already started, and we can run them through this assessment engine. And so once you have that, then it's really sort of a back and forth iterative process that with us and our customers to review policies, and then set them through, internally. Maybe you send it through legal, through your IT department if you have one, and around the organization for all the stakeholders to really review and edit, and back and forth. And then a lot of times we'll help in that process, provide guidance and consulting as you go through that, until they're ready to be, put through the CMMC audit process. And not only through the audit process, but you have to start sort of implementing those policies in your organization. That's where the maturity part of maturity model really, comes into play. And then it's usually recommended by the folks at CMMC to do an annual policy review. And we certainly agree with that. And in particular, if you have any updates within the year, any major new systems that are put in or policies that you want to enact, you need to do that on a more regular basis, but certainly annually. And that's really sort of that step helps you along the remediation path. And so step 3 is once you've got your policies in place, you don't have to do it in that order, but we try to start there. And that's really the hard part. And then you need to sort of remediate all the other POAM items. And then as you're doing that, you're going to need to collect evidence and store that evidence somewhere, because eventually the auditors are going to ask you to show your evidence. And again, certification assistant that we've used on the assessment piece also has a place to store evidence. So it's a great sort of combination of tools to help us through this process. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to walk you through a couple of case studies of a small manufacturer and then of a large DoD contractor. I know we get a lot of questions around, can we use this solution ourselves? Where do we need help, et cetera? How long does it take? In general, small companies with no IT department or limited IT department, but with no cybersecurity expertise or compliance expertise, generally need some outside help. Now, Policy Pro has a lot of great guidance within the tool, but it's probably faster and more economical to bring in an outside firm like ours or another consulting firm to help you with this process. And because documentation is not on the top of everyone's list to do, it usually gets pushed by the wayside, and people are generally happy to have someone do the entire process for them, or at least most of it. And we find that true with most small manufacturers. So again, when this particular manufacturer, we did their readiness assessment. We used certification assistant for that. So the reason that it's helpful is, doing the readiness assessment first is you find out a lot of the information, what's in play, what's in place already. So we had a lot of information, a lot of data, whatever policies they might have had, plus a lot of information about their network and their operations and how they run things. Okay, and then we take the Policy Pro tool and set that up, right? Put whatever policies are in there or set up the templates. And then we just use that tool to build all the policies in draft form. And then you have to do that iterative process with the customer, but mostly it's us understanding how to interpret what needs to go into the policies with the help of Policy Pro and their scoring engine. And so we go back and forth there. We then finalize policies until they're ready, 100% complete and ready for audit. And then what we like to do for those customers is we like to do a quarterly review just for policy enforcement, because the policies aren't really going to get you all the way there for CMMC unless you're actually showing how you were enforcing those policies and documenting that. So we work with our customers to make sure that they're doing the things they're saying, right? So the policies are what are you going to do? And a lot of times you'll write standard operating procedures on how you're going to do those things. And so those are, a lot of times that's good evidence on how you're implementing those. So it's good to sort of have somebody who's managing that process ongoing. So if you have someone in-house that has some cybersecurity expertise, and you can have them, write these policies and enforce those policies, that's great. But if you don't, you can work with a company like us. So then if you look at a larger company, they usually have more resources, obviously on the IT side, but a lot of them have cybersecurity and compliance expertise because they've been dealing with a lot of these complicated issues besides just the CMMC and DFARS, right? There's ITAR things they've been used to implementing or working with, and ISO maybe, or some other kinds of compliance issues around cybersecurity. So they'll tend to have some of these resources, but want to look for outside guidance just to help them make sure they're doing everything correctly, because they generally don't have anybody who's CMMC expert on step. Like, our folks have been doing this for several years now. So they'll have policies for non-CMMC related reasons, and they have cybersecurity resources. A lot of times they'll have already done their assessment in-house. We may just check it or review it. But this particular customer asked us to do their readiness assessment. They wanted an outside objective review of it. Then from there, we set up Policy Pro for them to manage and use, and we train them on how to use it. It's very easy to use. It's very little training. So for somebody who's got some cyber expertise and some compliance expertise, it's a tool that'll make their lives a lot easier. And then really we kind of just worked with them when they had questions. So we'd have weekly calls with them to go through any questions that they had, they weren't sure of a particular policy and how it was interpreted internally. So they got our guidance there. And that went on, I think, for 5 or 6 weeks. It's only, they're probably spending 2 or 3 hours or 5 hours a week or so on that. And so they were taking their time and, having everyone review it. And again, when they were completed, we kind of QA'd it after it went through their internal review. And then it's ready to go. And again, in general, it just, they're doing their own policy enforcement, making sure that their internal people are doing what the policies suggest. And then there's an annual review process that they bring us in just to again, have an iterative conversation about what's changed and just updating their policies. And that's really it. So again, I think the summary is that great tool. If you have some expertise, you can do this on your own, and maybe use an outside firm to help you with bits and pieces. But it can also be used to, economically do this in a fast and economical way. So there you have it. I think that is all I have.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Tim. And we'll be bringing Tim back on to help us answer some of the questions that were submitted. So if you've got some particular questions for Tim, this is the contact information for his company, SysArc, as well as Tim himself. I'm sure he'd be happy to reach out and answer any questions that come over. And as I mentioned, we'll be bringing Tim back at the end of this session to help us answer the questions that were submitted. So with that, let me turn it over to Sean, who will be walking us through the Policy Pro demo.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kevin. And just to reiterate what Tim was talking about with having the documentation as evidence, I've worked with clients that have had everything from a control perspective done correctly. Now, this was under the ISO 27001 standard, but they had done all the controls correctly, but because of an incident that occurred, they got audited and didn't have the documentation. So they essentially failed that audit. And then they came to ISMS Solutions because we had software that was usable to help generate the policy and to assess it. And then they were able to pass that audit using the tools that are at the foundation of the Policy Pro platform. But With that said, we're going to hop right into our account, and we are going to bypass some of the registration stuff where you'll be putting in your organization name and other contact information so that, should something go wrong on a technical side of things, we can reach out from our support department in West Virginia, and we're able to help you through that and then, make sure that it's working correctly and it's easy enough for you to use that you're not being frustrated by the work. Now, what we're going to do today is we are going to work on the 800-171. And the reason we're doing that is because if you start with the 171, being that it's already the required standard, you have to be compliant with this because you have a DFARS clause. Now, the other benefit is that all 110 of these controls will transfer over to your CMMC level 3, where you're only left with about 20 new practices that you have to fill out on top of what you've already done in the 171. Now, as Tim was mentioning, that if you don't have any type of documentation, or you're not really sure how to structure it, how to put it together, or where to start, you can go on the Policy Pro platform and you're able to jump right to the Policy Builder. But before we do that, I want to touch on a couple things on our dashboard so that we can know what they do and how they function and how they can be beneficial to the user. The first thing you're going to see is our Bloomberg Government Analysis. This is part of the trial and subscription levels of Policy Pro, and it's just articles from Bloomberg Government that go over, federal contracting, any, new available contracts that may be coming out, and it's just more of a news feed that we do send out a weekly newsletter for to keep you informed around federal contracting. So that's there for you if if you find a half hour that you want to read up on something, it's there for you. And we took care of the the subscription and everything that goes with that, and you can just read the articles. The next thing that we have is our document relevance dashboard. This is going to give a high-level overview of all of the different documents that you have assessed on your Policy Pro account. The other thing that this does is that it creates an audit record. So it can, you can go back and prove to an auditor, I've gone back and I've, reviewed this document, I reassessed it at this point in time, because if we go into the document assessment, we can see that it's grabbing a timestamp of when I uploaded this document for review. So I can say, I uploaded this on July 15th. I can come down a little bit further and I can say, oh, well, I reviewed it and put it back up on the 13th of August. So now I'm showing that review process in real time and I'm keeping a record of it so that if I'm asked, are you meeting the requirement for a review? You can say, yes, we are, and here's the evidence for it. But we're going to start off like most people do that don't have written policy in the policy builder. The first thing that you're going to see every time you come in is going to be our prepare, our gather, and the consult phases here. The first one, general information about what this particular policy family will be covering, and then, what is going to be included in a document of this type. The next part is our gather. This is a list of documents. It's not an exclusive list, but it's a primer list that can get you started on your document collection. Because most of the time, the way that you're dealing and meeting a requirement of, the regulatory standard, whether it's the 171 or CMMC, you already have that documentation. That could be any maintenance records, training records, employee handbooks, any kind of documentation that's touching on what your policies are from a cybersecurity standpoint. So you likely have these around, especially if you're working with a managed service provider like SysArc. You'll have an SLA detailing what they're covering and what their responsibilities are according to your cybersecurity policy. And then our last one here is consult. This is, we understand that you may not be a cybersecurity expert, or you may not even work in IT at all. You've just been voluntold to do this by your ownership or by your manager, and you're going to need information. So we're giving you some ideas of who in the organization will be helpful for you, as well as, going to an outside contractor like SysArc and saying, hey, I'm confused about what I have to do. Am I doing this correctly? Because it doesn't hurt to ask for help if you're not sure about something. So we're going to go ahead and click on that Get Started. And now we're going to be in the policy builder proper. There are a couple of housekeeping items at the top of the screen. We have our organization name, which will be auto-populated from when you register your account. You'll put in your company name, and this will then be, dispersed throughout the document where applicable. Now, if this changes, you get sold, you change the name or it's spelled wrong, we've had those come through. It's not a big deal. Call our support folks. They can get you, straightened out. And it usually takes no more than 5 minutes to approve that, it is your account and that you want it changed. The next one is going to be able to be editable. This is what department is responsible for this particular policy. Now you can do, in this case, senior management. We can change this to, we'll say it's the IT department's responsibility. And then when we click away, it will save this in here. And then we have it documented who, as a department, is responsible for the enforcement and adherence of this particular policy. Our next one is our issue date. This is helpful for, building that audit trail. We're saying this document was issued at this point in time. So again, we have a timeline of when we're issuing new documents, when we're reviewing them, and when they're being approved. So we can go ahead and change that however we need to. We're going to put in the individual who is going to approve this policy. They will own, or they will have the responsibility of the policy and making sure that everything is implemented correctly. So you can put that here. And then we just have our tracking. You can use this for any type of, versioning that you want to use on the platform or for any document really. Now, the next part here that we're going to be looking at is our purpose. Every document has to have a purpose. It's why are you writing this particular document? And because Uncle Sam or the DoD said so isn't really a good enough purpose. So we have provided some boilerplate language. You can adopt the language if you like it. You can modify it however you want. And you can modify this language by clicking on this little black circle with the white pencil icon in it. So you can go ahead and click on that, and it will open up a text editor so you're able to change it on the site itself. You don't have to, download anything or upload anything. You can make the changes that you want right here in the text editor. So if I just go ahead and if I could spell, that would be fantastic. So we put in changes, we're going to hit save, and now you can see that the changes that I made are applied directly to the purpose. And this is where you can customize the document to your organization. Our next one that we're going to cover here is our scope. Again, we have to define what is this covering and who is required to adhere to it. Because the last thing you want is to not include a group or an individual, and then they completely disregard the policy, cause damage, and they're like, yeah, I wasn't in the scope, so I didn't have to, sorry. Because, and again, you want to make sure everybody who is affected by this policy is included in the scope. And we do that with our, template language saying all users are responsible for adhering to this. Now everyone is required to follow this policy, and if they don't, there are consequences determined by the powers that be within the organization. Now, what we have beyond this, that we've determined why we're writing this, what it's covering, and who has to adhere to it, or who it's, covering, we have the actual controls themselves. So what we have here is that we do have, several different groups. So if two controls are related to each other, or a number of controls are related to each other, they're broken down into a group and then given a generalized direction as to what this group of controls is trying to cover. In this case, it's documents detailing the limiting of system access to authorized users. Because at 3.1.1, we're determining who has access to our system. What users, what devices, what processes acting on their behalf are allowed to access our system. Then in the 3.1.2, we're going into what is the level of access per, individual role or group role that we're allowing for these users to do, right? Is there administrative rights? Is there just normal rights with no writing privilege, but only read privilege? And this is where we're going to explain that so that everyone is aware of it, because the policies stand as the rule of how we do things as an organization. So whenever there's a question, how am I supposed to do this? What's the protocol? You go back to this policy, because you have to keep not only reviewing it and improving it, you have to properly train everybody in the organization to be able to follow it. Because if they're not following the rule, there's really no reason for having them. So we want to make sure that they're following it and that they understand what they're responsible for according to their policy. Now, again, we can go ahead and we can use the edit icon here. We can go in and we can make changes if we need to. So, if I don't agree with this particular section, not really sure why I wouldn't, I can remove it. It's no longer a part of my policy, and I'm going to save it. And as we can see, I now have a timestamp of exactly the day, time, and the user that made the last edit to this particular document. So if I'm going through it and I'm like, this doesn't seem like where I left it, you can say, did somebody else edit this? At what time, and who do I need to talk to? But there is another way that you can go about editing your policy document, and that's to export it out of the system into a Word document. So to do that, we're going to click on the little black square in the lower right-hand corner with the upward white arrow on it to export the document out of the system on Policy Pro to our local workstation. So we'll go ahead and we'll click that button, and we're going to get this pop-up. This pop-up is just telling us that, hey, we've noticed that you haven't made changes to the following sections. So it's very likely that this is still template language and hasn't been customized to your organization. So you'll want to go back and make sure that you're covering these items. Now, we can go ahead and click yes. That will export the document out for us into the Word document format. And then we're able to open that up and edit it as just any other Word document. Now, this is helpful because from the way that I write policy is I like it together. So I can say, I covered this in this section. I want to make sure it's consistent in the next one where it's affected. And it gives, at least from my perspective, a more linear approach to writing a policy document. But writing a policy document on your own is fine. It may not be the best one ever written, but we do have some testing we can do to see where it's at. Now, if we click on policy assessment, we're going to go into where we were before, looking at the different documents when they were uploaded, and we're going to go down to the very bottom here. You can see that I upload quite a number of documents. We're going to hit the upload button. This will bring us into our queue. We'll attach the document from our File Explorer. And now we can see that we've selected a document. We can add in additional documents if we want. And this will then aggregate these several documents together as though they were one and score it accordingly. This is helpful if you have existing policy that's broken down into smaller pieces. You have an acceptable use policy, a password policy, a multi-factor authentication policy. You can put them all together and it will treat it as though it was one access control document. We can also clear them out if we don't like what we've selected, but we're going to take a look now at access control and see what our score is bringing back and how we can, look at the score and determine what we need to do. The first thing that we're going to see is that we have an overall score of 70%. Again, if it was one of my daughters, I wouldn't be pleased with this as a score, but it's not on an academic scale. We do it as to relevance to the particular policy family being assessed. This means that your relevance is at the 50% range, so you're in the good range above that 50%, saying that you're covering a majority of what you need to cover. Now, we also have in here our model similarity. This is so that, if you are using one of our templates, it's checking to make sure that you've customized it enough so that you're not just, outputting a template and then trying to use that as your own. And, again, doesn't affect your score. We're just saying, hey, if you're using our template, you need to customize it more than you have to really make it your own policy. And then word count works on the same premises, doesn't affect the score all that much, but it's saying, is this document long enough to be covering the topic it should be covering? You're not going to cover access control in 500 words, and it's there to tell you, you need to add a little bit more to this rather than just saying we do things to make stuff work. While that may be an effective policy, in a motorcycle shop where I used to work, not so much in cybersecurity. Now, the next important thing that we have in our scoring assessment is our Kenny system. And the way that we get to see what our Kenny results are is that we're going to click on this link right here to see our detailed scorecard. So we're reiterating what we already have seen from our overall assessment. And now we're going to see two different sections of Kenny, or key elements not included. We have our general policy Kennys, which are different key terms and phrases that are typically found in documents of this type, but don't have a direct connection to this part of the standard. So they're recommendations that you may want to go in and add these, concepts into your document, but it doesn't match up directly with the access control policy family from this standard. The ones that do match up that way are our control specific Kennys. And what those are they have direct mapping to the standard, and we're telling you precisely where in your document you should be finding this particular concept. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this first Kenny, we're going to review our documentation and see, are we adequately covering this particular concept that we can move on to the next, or do we need to add more to our policy? So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at our document, and if you see here it says 3.1.22 is the control that it should be found in. So we've already gone there in this copy of our document, and essentially it's saying that sensitive information like CUI or FCI should not be posted on a publicly accessible system. So we need to explain what we're doing to ensure that that doesn't happen. The first thing that we're doing, we're designating authorized individuals to do the posting to these particular types of networks. Then we're training those individuals to understand what is appropriate to post, what is not appropriate to post. And then we're doing two different review processes in order to determine that, for one, we haven't posted anything of a sensitive nature, and two, that we're reviewing our publicly accessible systems to ensure nothing of, no sensitive information was accidentally put onto that particular, system. So I would say that, we have a process in place about how we're going to deal with posting things to our publicly accessible systems to ensure that CUI and FCI do not make it onto those systems. However, there's an additional layer that I like to do when checking a policy document. And what that is if we take out the level 3 CMMC assessment guide, where we can go into the individual controls or practices and determine what are the requirements that we have to meet. So if I go in here and, it may be confusing, why am I looking at the .004 when I'm talking about the 3.1.22? If I scroll down here to the reference section for this one, this control is the .22 from NIST in CMMC. So they are the same thing. The language is the same. The requirements are the same. But now I have a list of requirements that I can go through as a checklist, because this is what the assessors, when you're doing a CMMC certification audit, will be looking for. So we might as well have the test in front of us to study from instead of going into it blind. But if we look at the different things that we have to do, it says individuals are authorized to post. That's our first thing that we do. The second one, that, the procedures are identified. We're training those individuals how to do, what to go through, what procedures to follow to post to a publicly accessible system. And then we have our review process prior to posting, and that we're reviewing to ensure that it doesn't include it already or that it got there accidentally. And then we can tie in that fifth requirement of we have mechanisms to remove and address the posting in our policy. So now I've gone through, I got a key term that our system said, we're not sure that you've covered this, go back and double check. So now I went back, I reviewed my document, I've compared it to the requirements of this particular control, and I'm meeting it part for part. So I'm pretty good. And this is just template language that's already in there. But to Tim's point from earlier, you have to enforce this to make it your policy. Just saying that, we're doing the industry best practice isn't good enough. You have to actually do it. So you can use our template language to give you that jumping off point to create a customized policy for your organization that covers what it needs to cover. Now, real briefly, before I run out of time for our demo today, I do want to pull another one and take a look at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our media protection policy. We're going to just real quick pop out a copy. Now it looks like I've edited everything in this section except for the purpose and scope. That's okay. I export that out. We can now go back down to our media protection in our policy assessment, and I can upload a document and see how I did. So we go ahead, we pop the document in, we're going to submit that, and then we're going to get a score in just a couple of seconds. So as you can see, there are, there were changes to the template language made, and the score went down a little bit. This isn't a bad thing, because the way that these scoring algorithms work is that they're looking for how relevant is your document, and are you covering everything you should be covering, to make sure that you have what you need. So, well, again, we're in the good range, everything looks good. We'll look at our Kenny. So now we're looking at access control records. So we need to look into 3.8.1, but I'm not really up to date on access control records. So what I can do is I can read the discussion, which is directly from the standard. We're just taking it from the standard itself and putting it in front of the user so you don't have to flip back and forth. And I can say, okay, we're talking about different types of media and how it's handled and limiting access to them. So now I have a pretty good idea, but I'm not really sure. So my next step, we have this link here that will take you to the resource library, or I'm sorry, the reference library, or you can go there on our navigation pane. But we're going to go ahead and click that link and pull up our reference library. So I'm working on 3.8 media protection. I'm going to select from the table of contents, media protection. And now, as we can see, I have a number of documents pertaining to media protection. So what I can do is I can say, which one of these best fits what I'm trying to do? And we'll say, managing security of mobile devices in enterprise. So we'll click on that. And now we're going to leave the Policy Pro platform in a new tab. And we're going to go to the NIST.gov. This is where the standard, the 800-171 comes from, as well as where the rest of the 800 series of special publications resides to really back up both the 53, which is the larger standard for federal agencies, and the 171. All that 800 series is there to back up those two standards. So I can go ahead and open up this 800-124, and it's going to give me the PDF of the document itself. And then I can go to the table of contents and I can find precisely what I'm trying to figure out from the authoritative source in the NIST organization. So I can say, okay, we're looking at, untrusted mobile devices. We can click on that in the table of contents. We get 2 paragraphs of information so that we can read over this, get a little bit of education on it so that we can make a better educated decision. And if we still have, we're not quite sure what it means, that's what the consultants are there for. That's why the, Exostar is there with their CMMC team. Email as well as, MSPs like SysArc are there to help you with that extra little bit of push that, in the case that you don't really grasp a particular concept. But you can go through, read the documentation that you need for what you're working on, and then make that decision and go on to the next piece. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin because I don't want to miss out on our Q&A session for the last 15 minutes.
Great, Sean. Thanks so much. Let me go ahead and share back out. Great. So as I mentioned before, we had during the registration process, we'd asked everybody to submit questions if they had some. We've gone and selected some of those. And as I mentioned before, if we don't get to your question, we'll certainly follow up via email. If other questions came up during today's session, please go to the Exostar website, submit your questions there. You'll also have a chance to chat with somebody as well. So with that said, let me go ahead and get a question teed up here. So one of the questions that came in was really about the, if you will, the help a company has to have on staff to work with these. So they asked, do we need a high-level network engineer to meet NIST 800-171 and CMMC requirements? Tim, I'll turn this over to you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, it certainly helps. It just depends on the type of experience and certifications that person might have, right? If they have any kind of cybersecurity cert, like a CISSP, which some high-level network engineers have, and our high-level network engineers we've put through that process can are beneficial, right? Because at some point, whether or not it's for writing policies or if it's for implementing the various, processes and tools you need to implement, like multi-factor authentication and some other, other tools and processes, a lot of times that's, that goes through your IT department and those high-level network engineers. So the other last thing I'd say on that is, you need to have some, separation of roles to go through this process, right? So you can't really have the high-level network engineer be sort of the program manager for the cybersecurity, who's sort of overlooking and overseeing what the IT department is implementing, right? It's almost like helping, just auditing yourself, right? So it helps to have somebody like that, but you also should have someone who is separated out that can, oversee that process for you.
Great, thanks, Tim. Another question that came in, which I think is especially relevant today as more and more people start to utilize SaaS solutions, was more than a few of the requirements apply to in-house IT systems. If you are on a third-party cloud, can you answer those not applicable to all those requirements that you may be, if you will, have outsourced to a provider?
I'm going to jump on that one first,
Sure, Sean,
Kevin,
run ahead.
but absolutely not. Just because you choose to do something off premises doesn't mean that you don't still have a responsibility to that process. Now, maybe you brought in an MSP to manage it for you. All you're doing is transferring the risk. You still have some responsibility to that system, and you have to explain how it works. Because it'd be like, for Policy Pro, oh, we have it on the cloud. Well, that's not a sufficient explanation to, to put the users at ease that, we're actually on the government cloud because it has higher requirements on it and it's a little bit more secure. But again, it's that same analogy that I can't just say, oh, well, yeah, my nephew does it, so don't worry about it. He does it outside the business. No, you absolutely have to have a policy, even if your policy is to not allow something. You still have to have a policy saying that you don't allow it.
Makes sense.
So,
Tim,
so
anything you wanna add?
if I could also interject,
Absolutely.
so really the objective here is to secure your corporate network, whether it's with in-house servers and or with cloud services. It's still part of your corporate network. So yes, you are responsible for doing all the things you need to do, protect the government's data, whether it resides in the cloud or in your own office, right? So it's really it's set up to be your corporate network. The other thing I'd like to talk a little bit about, which people bring up with the cloud, which is, hey, why don't we just move all of our CUI into the cloud, right? And then I'll be done. Well, that's really sort of um, that's not going to be allowed. There'll be some sharing of, some things that are in the cloud. You'll be able to not have to do all the things, but really at the end of the day, our advice to customers is you should protect your entire network, not just your customers' data, which is the CUI that the DoD is, but all of your own data, all of your own intellectual property, all your employees' data, and make your entire organization and your entire corporate network secure. This is just one mechanism by following the CMMC standard, but it'll reduce your risk around malware or ransomware that's rampant right now that could cost you millions. So our advice is always, especially with the scoping questions, people ask, should I just segment my data and just do all the controls and document everything around that part of my network? You can, but I think it's almost as easy or easier to just sort of secure your entire infrastructure, your entire corporate network.
And just to add on to that, I mean, if you were to be breached by a hacking group or an adversarial power, whatever the case, it's not like you see in Hollywood where they're like, I'm going to go find the one file I'm looking for and take that. They're going to basically do a smash and grab where they get access to the system. They're going to exfiltrate everything, and then they'll sort it out after they're done, because the longer they're in a system, the more likely they are to be caught, to be noticed, and to have that attack fail. So they're just going to break in, take everything. That means your intellectual property that you've developed outside of your DoD contracts, your employees' personal, medical, insurance, financial information, any of that stuff, because like, especially if you're working at a contract that requires secret or top secret clearance, all that information has now been stolen, and it can be used against not only the organization but the employees of the organization as well.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Tim. So, Tim, in your discussion, you talked a little bit about scoping. So that kind of leads us to another question we got that came in about. So, do you have any advice or suggestions on the scoping of this kind of solution, if you will, or to get through the process? And if you do engage with an MSP or an MSSP, is it a requirement that they're also CMMC compliant or have their score submitted, et cetera?
Yeah, so on the scoping piece, right? I think I mentioned that in my last comment, right? So I think a lot of folks are trying to scope out where their CUI is, right? And spend time identifying that and having the process, whether it's building your policies or implementing other security tools and processes around a certain segment that is covered, within that, enclave per se of where the CUI resides. A lot of times trying to find all the CUI and identify where they are in the systems and everything is more trouble than if you just try to do the secure, your entire corporate network. So there's that's my take on it. But for scoping of an audit, say, that's another conversation. But there'll be guidance coming out from the CMMC folks, hopefully imminently, about scoping of all of this officially when they come out. But to answer the second part of that question about an MSP or an MSSP, right? Your MSP, if you have one, they really need to understand this CMMC and cybersecurity stuff and how to implement the right tools and how to get you to where you need to go, right? And a lot of times most MSPs aren't there yet, right? We've been doing this for 5 years, but we see other MSPs out there that have been doing it for a while, but a lot of them are just sort of catching on, right?
Sure.
But your MSP is really treated like an employee, right? They're just your outsourced IT manager or your outsourced CISO or outsourced security analyst, but if they're, if so, and a lot of the, CMMCAB registered provider organizations, they're MSPs that have this talent, right? And these, so, but they will have gone through this process. They're not required to. If they're storing any of your customers' data, then there is potential that they will have to be sort of compliant as well. But so just, I think a lot of the people who were doing this work like us, we're not going to be audited, but we're going through that process so that we are DFARS compliant and CMMC compliant, so that there is no question, and we're giving our customers the right guidance. So I don't think the requirement is there that they have to be it. At least there's not been any guidance for that, but it's a good idea.
Sure. Makes sense.
Right. And to add a little bit, I think I know where this question comes from, because back in early 2020 or maybe late 2019, Katie Arrington had mentioned that anyone doing any business with the DoD or a DoD contractor would require a minimum level 1. Now, there hasn't been any further official definition for that, and hopefully that will be coming soon. But I think that's where that idea comes from, is that it's anybody who even touches it has to have a minimum level 1, which again is 17 controls that are all very, very basic cyber hygiene stuff. And most MSPs will likely be doing that anyway.
Thanks, Sean. And we did have a question that came in about CUI and CMC level. So I'm going to ask that here. So it's there. It says we're a subcontractor who does not handle CUI, nor do any of the other contractors we work with. They would just want to know if they understand it correctly, that they only have to be at CMC level 1. Is that correct?
It will depend upon what the contract that they are being awarded says. If that contract says level 1, that's fine. You can get away with level 1. If it says level 3, you need to be level 3. So yes, the general idea that if you don't touch CUI, which is a nebulous term to begin with, because it used to be, for official use only, or there was 6 or 7 different designations for CUI. So, I mean, even if, like, say you have a COTS solution where you're buying a piece of equipment and then configuring it, that configuration is considered CUI. It may not have been labeled that way, but because you created a configuration to achieve a task for the DoD, you've now created CUI that you now have to protect accordingly. So, but at the end of the day, it will come down to what the contract dictates. If it says level 3, you have to be level 3, or you will not be awarded that contract.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's yet to be seen, right? they're still going through that rulemaking process that they went and enacted last year, and they're doing a review. Hopefully by December timeframe, all of this will be spelled out in more detail, and they'll have some final answers and kick forward, right? But again, the interim rule, came out with DFAR 70, 19, and 20, which is if in any new contracts or awards, I saw that was one of the other questions. If they're calling out DFAR 70, 19, and 20, you have to, have an assessment done and an SPRS score implemented or put into the system. And then you are subject to an audit by DIBCAC at some point. There won't be many of those, but you'll be subject to it. So your score is going to need to be correct and accurate. So that's where everyone should be, whether they're CMMC level 1 or 2 or 3. You should be going along those lines. And if you're trying to be CMMC level 3 at some point, you need to put that maturity into your organization by having these policies done and then starting to enforce those policies. You can't do it at the last minute and expect to pass if you don't show any maturity because you just implemented everything the week before the audit. So this stuff takes 6 to 9 months potentially to get everything in place. So the DoD and your primes are probably, saying, hey, let's get this stuff done now, right? And let's secure our organizations too. Absolutely.
So we're at the top of the hour. So as I mentioned before, we will follow up with the questions we didn't get to. If you would like to check out the other tool that we have around this certification assistant, please do. That's also available from the Exostar website, exostar.com/CA free trial. And if you'd like some additional information or some help in this process, there's a ton of information available out there. You'll get this as part of the deck when you come out. As we sign off today, I want to thank you, Sean, and thank you, Tim, for joining us. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.
Pleasure as always to be here.